Good afternoon, and welcome to Sadler's webinar on Get Your Students Talking Mathematically. My name is Janine Ferrara, and I'm the Director of Product Management for all Sadler's Math and Digital products. With me today is Ellen Edmonds, Sadler's Executive Director of Professional Development. Today, Ellen's going to walk us through how to jumpstart rich student discourse and increase collaboration in K-8 math classrooms. Today, you'll learn how to use conversation starters, meaningful questions, and the four operations to gain insight into your instructional process and students' learning processes. Before we begin, let me remind you that your audio is on mute, meaning you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So throughout the presentation, should you have any questions, we'd appreciate it if you would put them in the question or chat box, and Ellen and I will address them at the end of the presentation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ellen.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm excited to be talking with you about how you get your students talking mathematically. We've already done the introductions. I have a quick little thing I want to talk to you about in terms of math talk. Then we'll talk about why we care about student discourse and the specific benefits to students. We'll talk about best practices in terms of promoting meaningful discourse in the classroom, and we'll answer any questions you might have. So I want us to think a little bit about our classrooms as we have this discussion and think about the discourse that occurs in our classrooms and how we might improve the quality of that discourse. And when I think about that, if we were together, maybe we would have a conversation that's centered on mathematics. When we're teachers of English language arts, we are very attuned to famous authors or our favorite authors. We know our favorite topics and genres, and we know the things that get us excited about reading, and we discuss those with our friends, with our families, with our students. I think it's a different thing when we think about mathematics. Very few of our students can tell us who their favorite mathematicians are, or even who some famous mathematicians are, and they can't tell you about their favorite math topics, or the favorite class that they've had, or the favorite particular experience that they've had in mathematics. And so one of the things we want is for students to be excited about, love math and engaged in math. We don't want to think it's okay to say I'm bad at mathematics. We would never say we're bad at reading and brag about that. So we really want students very positively focused on math and thinking mathematically, and so discourse is very key to that. In fact, we know that effective math instruction is something that engages students. It really involves them in meaningful learning experiences, both as an individual and collaboratively. Those experiences allow them to increase their understanding of math and allows them to be able to make sense of mathematical ideas, to reason mathematically, and to explain and justify their thinking. And the evidence is very clear that students who are engaged in effective mathematics classrooms are students who are going to be far more successful as mathematicians. We have great evidence about what those types of classrooms look like. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that the classroom environment has to be non-threatening. Students have to be comfortable making mistakes and comfortable talking, comfortable explaining what they don't understand and being open about that. And there have to be very well-planned tasks that students engage in and opportunities for students to use a range of mathematical tools, models, and representations. And discourse is an integral part of that type of classroom. The research is also really clear that there are several teaching practices that are critical to being effective in your mathematics instruction. These teaching practices were highlighted by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and much of this presentation relies on the research and the policies and the practices that the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics have shared with us over time. So as we think about it, there are many things that should be in place. You can see 8 particular practices that should be in place today we're only going to really focus on one, and that is facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse. Bear in mind that the other practices need to be in place to maximize student gains. So what are we talking about when we talk about effective mathematical discourse or positive discourse or productive discourse? What we're talking about is a discussion among the students in our classroom that really focuses on a specific task and really encourages thinking and reasoning and problem solving. And that interaction and that thought process paired with conversation creates a situation where students' conceptual understanding is deepened, something we're really looking for in our current math instruction. And as teachers, that means that these conversations are not happenstance. We plan very carefully our lessons and structure them in such a way that students are encouraged to interact with each other and with us as the educator. And as we're doing that we're focusing on places where students have demonstrated a gap in understanding. And we're promoting opportunities for students to talk about math and to be able to use precision as they do so, expressing the ways that they have solved problems, the process they've used, and how it makes mathematical sense. And so those opportunities for conversation really provide that prime fodder for success. We have to, as teachers, be able to carefully plan the questions that we ask. And those strategic questions really draw out students and get them thinking mathematically and talking mathematically. And in doing that, we also are teaching our students to listen to each other carefully and to be able to analyze the work of others that's expressed and critique it. And through learning to critique the reasoning of others, students learn to more effectively critique their own reasoning and ideas and really be able to solve problems in a very efficient way. Math discourse has very key characteristics if it's effective and productive. And the first is that it builds upon the way our students think. It doesn't build on our thinking as teachers, but where our students are, and it's respectful of our students and their thinking. It provides lots of opportunities for students to talk about their thinking, to clarify any understandings and correct any misunderstandings, and be able to develop arguments and proofs. And those effective opportunities for discourse and effective conversations increase the learning of the whole class, not just individual students. The research shows that when we provide these opportunities for discourse in our classroom, the students benefit. They benefit in terms of growing their skills, in terms of allowing us to understand where they are and intervene when there are misconceptions so that students' practice is more productive. And we see again and again from the research that students who collaborate with their peers and discuss with their peers develop deeper learning and understanding. So what do we mean again with when we talk about discourse? What's a concise way of talking about it? I think this definition, though a little bit old, is really a great way to speak of it. So it's ways of representing, thinking, talking, agreeing, and disagreeing. The way ideas are exchanged and what the ideas entail, and is shaped by the tasks in which students engage as well as by the nature of the learning environment. So that definition concisely and clearly articulates productive or meaningful discourse. So we use this discourse so students learn the content that we're teaching, so that their reasoning capabilities, their critical thinking increase. And not just in terms of mathematics, but this actually gets applied across the content areas, so that their conceptual understanding deepens and that it's connected to the process that they use, and their ability to discuss and communicate as a result of that. How do we improve students' reasoning skills? Well, it isn't something that is innate. I think many of us as educators have felt as though this was something that a student had as a gift. but in fact is something that can be strengthened and taught. If each time students make a claim, we ask them for the evidence, or another student can provide a counter example, we start to see the reasoning process get put into place. And so there are very specific steps for making sure that students think and discuss things in a logical way and use their critical and reasoning. When we provide that step-by-step approach to teaching students to think critically and reason, and we incorporate discourse as a part of it, we actually see students attain higher order thinking skills and students able to attack more cognitively demanding tasks. So we want to provide the right opportunities for students so that they link their prior knowledge to what they're learning currently, so that they're able to think critically, so that they're able to reflect on their own thinking, make adjustments, refine and amend that thinking and the process that they use, and so that they feel competent and comfortable as mathematicians, and they really want to engage in math discussions and math problem solving. So those reasoning skills are taught and supported throughout the work we do. And we do want students really thinking about their understanding of math. We know that in English language arts, metacognition is something that we model and teach. We've been much less clear about the importance of that in mathematics, but we want students thinking out loud and thinking about their own understanding. Metacognition becomes really important for their development. And we know that it's easier to start out critiquing the reasoning of others. We learned that with our work in English language arts as students became peer editors and edited the writing of another and then could come back to their own writing and edit in the same way. So we want students really looking deeply at the work they're doing and thinking deeply about it and talking about it and really being open about that. And in that process, one of the things that tends to bubble up is opportunities for students to be honest about the fact that they don't understand something, that they may be able to rotely execute, mimic what the teacher has done, but they don't understand the why of what they've done. And again, as I mentioned before, one of the problems we have when we look at students' homework is that we may see students have an incorrect answer, but we don't recognize the misconceptions that they have, and so we don't address those quickly. We don't recognize the level of understanding of where along the continuum students are. But when students talk in our classrooms and we facilitate and walk from group to group or pair to pair, we start to hear the conversations and identify misconceptions and see when students don't understand something. As a community of learners, one of the things we really want to do is create a situation where every student is expected to participate and every student fully participates in the math discussions. And that's an expectation we as teachers have to set out. And as I mentioned early on, the classroom environment has to be established in such a way that students don't feel threatened by talking about math and talking about their mathematical ideas, the procedures that they use, the various representations and the approaches and strategies that they've undertaken as they've been solving math problems. So that creation of a community of learners where each student matters and participates is important. We want students to really be engaged, and one of the things we know about our students across the grade levels is that they're social beings, and the opportunity to engage in discourse increases their engagement in the subject area. In this case, we're talking about math. But also, through those conversations that students have, they actually are gaining understanding and feeling more comfortable and confident as mathematicians, and that in turn also increases engagement. So the research shows that when we have a classroom environment that is open and non-threatening, and we require each student to participate actively in the conversations, we see students who check in as opposed to checking out, students who really start to love mathematics. It is important as we think about supporting discourse in our classroom that we recognize the value of teaching math vocabulary. Students can think mathematically but cannot conceive and discuss at the highest level without the language of math. And this is not something students innately pick up. That academic language is foreign to all students. So we really have to teach that vocabulary, and then we have to require that students use that precise math language as they discuss the problems that they've solved or the tasks that they're engaged in. And this will in turn increase their comprehension as they read math problems and they work on solving math problems. So it really becomes invaluable across the board. We know too that when each student is expected to participate and when they are respected and their thinking is respected, and when we recognize that we learn from each other, even as we make mistakes, we learn from each other. Students start to feel valued as members of the community, and that really increases their motivation to learn. So the benefits to students for when we provide meaningful and productive discourse opportunities are really clear. It's also really clear that as teachers we benefit also. And the end result is that student learning is maximized. So if we know that there are very significant benefits in terms of motivation and engagement and critical thinking, higher level thinking, being responsible and accountable mathematicians, what do we do as teachers to promote that discourse in our classroom? Many of us may have been making a number of efforts to put that into place previously. So how do we specifically do so? Well, generally there are some things obviously that have to take place. We have to, as I mentioned before, get students engaged. But we also have to think about not just the questions we ask, but the way we ask them and when we ask them. So one of the things that the research shows is as teachers, we have to sequence the questions we ask so that we engage the whole class in the discussion and analysis. So in other words, don't ask our strongest student the first question and have all of the beans spilled right off the bat, but rather stage the questions so that you're getting snippets that build upon each other to the same end result, getting more maximum engagement of students. And we also have to, as teachers, recognize that we both provide classroom management that facilitates discourse and moves students quickly to pairs or to small groups, but we also teach students and facilitate so that students begin to really put themselves out there and put their ideas out there and defend their approaches. So we have to coach individual students who need a little more support. And all of this can't just be for random discourse. We don't just want discourse for the sake of discourse, but rather thinking about all of this being in place so that at the end of a class or at the end of a unit, we have moved towards the mathematical goals we have with students having used discourse to deepen their understanding, to make the appropriate connections, and to reason at the highest level. So questions become the most important aspect of creating the right opportunities and the right sequence and the right results in terms of discourse. And we have to think ahead of time about the questions we'll ask and the way that we approach it, the students we ask them of, and the timing of it, so that, and the sequence of it. We also have to get really good at listening. If we don't pause, if we don't allow wait time, and if we don't stand back and listen, we miss the opportunities to hear students articulate something that will demonstrate a misconception or demonstrate a lack of understanding. We also need to make sure that we are listening so closely that we can ask students to clarify what they said and draw students out a bit. Ask students not to just explain the process they use, but to justify how it makes mathematical sense. And we want most of that orally, but we also want the transition from that oral format to the written format, and that bridge is important in our classroom. And then there are going to be times when we cannot dig as deep as we would like to, because either we will be excluding a group of students or we will be shortchanging other topics. So we have to think about the pacing and the level of depth that we're going to pursue in our discussions. As teachers, we have to decide when we intervene. So we facilitate, and that means we don't do the thinking for students and we don't do the talking for students. But there will be times that we have to connect to students' thinking and bridge that idea, or connect students' thinking to a specific mathematical idea we're trying to communicate, or coach students to use the precise language of math. We may also have, when students are struggling and students communicate lack of understanding, we may have to provide some information or clarify or model or add additional questioning to elicit the right information. So it isn't always just stand back and watch or be a fly on the wall. We play a really active role as educators. Facilitating doesn't mean you don't exist. It just means you don't stand in the front of the classroom and take control of what goes on. And as we move from group to group or pair to pair, we're really monitoring what's happening. We're seeing that all students are actively engaged and that you don't have one student doing the lion's share of the talking and the thinking and in some cases the teaching. So we want students working, first of all, probably in pairs. We find that that's the best way to introduce this strategy. Moving to small groups and then whole class, it's much safer to work with another student. And we have to think carefully about pairings. Our temptation as teachers is to pair a very strong student with a weaker student. But if we're really trying to elicit discourse, sometimes pairing students who are at a similar level is more beneficial and less threatening and results in a more productive discussion. We want students to get comfortable not just giving feedback without providing examples, but we want students thinking and giving feedback with very clear examples and very clear counterexamples so that they are supporting and providing evidence for what they're suggesting. We want to teach our students how to ask questions and to clarify. And we want our students to get comfortable trying the approaches of other students so that they learn that there are many strategies and many approaches, and some might be more beneficial or more efficient for us. So we really want that happening in our classroom. So what does the student's role look like in this discourse? I talked some about what the teacher's role looks like. Well, in many ways, the student mirrors some of what the teacher's doing. So the student certainly is listening and making careful notes and then responding to and questioning. The student is trying a varied set of tools and strategies and communication approaches rather than trying to mimic someone else. And we want students feeling comfortable initiating as opposed to always following. And we want students volunteering and making those presentations and solving problems in front of each other. We want students doing a lot of persuading, and we want students doing proofs, and we want students really thinking mathematically and arguing mathematically. We want true discourse. So discourse means exchanges back and forth or interchanges. It doesn't mean just talking at. So we don't want many teachers standing at the front of the room lecturing their peers. Rather, we want true, meaningful conversation. So if we know what it looks like, how do we get there? We know what it looks like from a teacher perspective when we have rich and meaningful discourse, productive conversations. We know what it looks like from a student perspective, but how in the world does that happen? How do we make that happen in our classroom? It's not something that occurs by magic. I mentioned a couple of times already that questioning is critical, and that really is the backbone of good teaching, but it's also the backbone of a classroom that has excellent and rich discourse. So planning our questions becomes critical, and then providing opportunities for discussion, and not just one approach, but time for partner talk, time for small group talk, and time for whole class, and there's that continuum across the year that starts first with partner talk. We really do plan very carefully when we want discourse to take place, and part of that planning is thinking about what it might look like and what outcomes might exist and what problems might exist. So if we have the quiet student, the student who's not engaged, the student whose language skills may be problematic, we want to think ahead of time about how to facilitate their active and positive engagement. So we really do have to think about how each step of the lesson goes. And we want to know what the end result should look like and do backwards planning. We need to know what is the understanding we hope to accomplish, and then think about how we get there as teachers. And when we think about these effective questions, they have very clear characteristics. We don't want to ask closed-ended questions. These open-ended questions are purposeful, and when we think about them, they have these primary purposes, but they may have some additional purposes. And we want to really think about, as we ask these questions, the way students typically respond, and how we move them from that more rote or surface level understanding to deeper understanding. So what is it about the question, the initial question, or the follow-up question that can take them to the next level? How might we elicit that understanding by asking just the right question? So here are some examples of the types of questions we might typically ask, and some of them are questions I'm sure you ask on a regular basis, but these are the types of questions that make students pause and reflect, and then articulate, and that certainly is the goal. As we think about really getting students involved in productive conversations, there are 5 teaching practices that really increase the quality of the discourse in our classroom. And the first are what are called talk moves. So these are things teachers can do to really improve the discourse in our classroom. And these 5 moves make a real difference for students. When I think about the first one, I think about what we make fun of in terms of counselors or psychologists. And basically your goal here is to make sure that you and the peers understand what the student is saying. So you just lead with that clarifying question. So you're saying, is that right? And then the next thing that works quite well is for you or your students to learn that repeating what someone says can make a big difference, or paraphrasing to a certain extent. First of all, it makes it clear that you've listened, you've heard what's been said, and that you value it. But it also does something in terms of the pacing of the conversation and allows for some deeper processing. Many of us don't think quickly and on our feet, and so that repetition creates a pause in the conversation and allows for some cognition. And then the next move that really is helpful is to think about whether what the person said is something you agree with or disagree with. That isn't then just repeating what your peer said, but really paying attention to the essence of what was said and determining if you think that that student is correct or not. And not just are they or are they not correct, but why? What about what they said justifies their thinking? And of course, part of the idea is to keep the conversation going. We know that by having multiple exchanges, we're automatically enriching the language and deepening the thinking. That's true with any conversation, but it's particularly true with a mathematics conversation. So using the tool of having, as a teacher, asking if someone would like to add on, or asking each other in the conversation, is there anything you would like to add, creates a situation where we make it clear to our students that we're not asking for repetition. Most of us who've taught younger grades know that our best and brightest students answer very quickly if we don't strategize. And then you hear the remaining students repeat exactly what that student said. What we want to do is make it clear to students that we're not looking for that repetition, that instead we're looking for additional information, novel ideas, additional thinking that would be beneficial. And so asking that question about adding on helps students move to that place. And then one of my favorite videos on the teaching channel is of a 4th grade teacher who really engages her students in wonderful math conversations. And one of the things she's so good about is wait time. It's particularly difficult for me. I always want to rush in and fill the void, the quiet time. What other teachers like to do is fill the void by thinking for their students. So what we want to do as teachers is sit on our hands, get our students to sit on their hands, count to 10, give plenty of time for a response. Often students intend to respond, but if we jump in quickly, they learn that they don't have to think and they don't have to talk because we do their work for them. So teaching that process of wait time and making ourselves stick with it values student input and gives them what they need, the time to process. And this is particularly true with students who are struggling with English. When we think about questions, not every question has the same value and not every question has the same purpose. There are 5 primary roles that questions have in our classroom, and what we want to do is think about when each role is necessary, in what sequence those roles should be laid out, and then the questions that go with them. So you get a sense of the way those questions work. So some questions are really about getting students to work collaboratively. Other questions are about students working independently. Some questions are about getting students to be more precise in their math and their calculations and their language, and other questions are getting them to be more innovative and doing more discovery work. And so we want to think very, very much about the types of questions we ask in that sequence. We also want students to benefit from the work of others. And so as we think about it, that idea of strategic questioning, as I mentioned before, is part about really sequencing the learning opportunity. And if we get students to start early on presenting ideas, we deepen the thinking as we move forward by getting students to talk about what they've heard and get them to summarize it and get them to extend that thinking. So it is that very careful process of laying out the questions, considering who you ask the questions of, and then getting students to respond to and think about all of that. As we think about our classrooms and the start of the school year, it's really important to have all of this thought through and put into place as the school year starts. It saves us quite a bit of time. So the first thing that we want is to set up the physical environment so that students can quickly move to paired or group work. And we as teachers can move from group to group or partner pair to partner pair without having to jump over desks. I watched a teacher 2 weeks ago have to ask students to get up from their seat, and she jumped over desks to get to the next group. When we have those kind of physical barriers, it really makes discourse and our role as facilitator quite difficult. So thinking about positioning the classroom so that we don't waste time moving into this more small group and paired work. And then also thinking about how very early on we set classroom norms and expectations so that each student participates, each student is respected and valued. And we as teachers have to model that also. That's some of the most difficult work we do, but some of the most important in terms of making sure discourse is in place. We as teachers really have to think about how we make it clear when behaviors are inappropriate. And sometimes modeling positive behaviors is far more effective than the more punitive or disciplinary approach of dealing with behaviors that we know are not productive. So that early start with the positive behaviors being rewarded and the positive models being established will make a very big difference in our classroom. For many students, math discourse is something new, a new expectation. They're used to math classrooms where the teacher stands in the front of the room and lectures, and there's very little that goes on that requires any full engagement or participation. So as teachers, we have to stage that work and start to lay out the opportunities in such a way that we transition students and create a sense of comfort and confidence. And so it can't all happen at once. But we certainly don't want to wait till the middle of the year. If we go for a half of the year without discourse, it's going to be quite difficult to set up those expectations and put all of this into place. What we really want is an opportunity for students to really benefit from this work. And so it may require some role playing on our part. It may require some more structured opportunities initially so that students feel supported and ready. This is one set of examples of behavioral norms that could be shared and used and posted in the class. I find it most beneficial when students brainstorm them together, develop them together, and agree upon them. I think the most important thing is recognizing that while we want the right answer in math, while we aim for precision, we learn a lot from errors. And errors give us an opportunity to quickly deal with misconceptions, but also they give an opportunity for rich discourse. So students should not be embarrassed or ashamed when their answers are incorrect, and we as teachers, again, have to do some of the modeling around that. So as a teacher, if our goal is rich, productive discourse in our classroom, we do a lot of planning up front. We do a lot of orchestrating day in and day out. We play a very active role, though we are teaching in a different way and facilitating in a different way. As I mentioned, these are the key roles that we play, and none of them easy. All of them take a lot of prior thinking and planning to make sure that we have the best opportunities for our students. The more we teach, the easier some of this gets, but it certainly isn't something that can happen on the fly. I think too many times we have classroom discussions that are not productive because they happen on the fly, and we know that this is something that has to be carefully planned. So when we think about anticipating, we have to think of all the strategies students might use and how they would typically respond and what results we might expect to see and what would be most beneficial. So that means in advance we may have worked the problem multiple ways. We may have asked our peer teachers about possibilities. We might have looked at the research. We might review what students did the previous year. We want to make sure that we really are well prepared for any potential outcome, and so the more we anticipate, the better. It's very tempting when students are working in small groups or pairs to get caught up on some of our desk work, but it's far more beneficial when we're circulating, when we're serving as a facilitator, when we're making anecdotal notes on index cards, and really thinking through where students are and really beginning to do the right things to keep students on track. So that means we're actively involved, we're circulating, we're listening, we're observing, and sometimes we're asking some additional questions so that we can keep students on track. Sometimes it means we might revoice something another student had said. We know that there are certain students who are always ready for a math conversation and always ready to present. But we really have to think about what's necessary for maximizing, engaging, and providing the optimal sequence for learning. So that means thinking about some students who we wouldn't typically put in front of the classroom or ask to present. And it means that we are really well aware of where each student is in the learning continuum and can take advantage of that and support that at the same time. So it's not random. It's not, who'd like to come to the board, which is certainly not going to give us the results that we need. And then as we think about what students are doing, we want to really highlight, point out, reinforce the strategies, the ideas, and the tools that will be most beneficial to students. So we can do that post-discussion through summarizing. We can do that by asking students to share aloud with the rest of the class. There are many ways we can do that, but we want to highlight those things that need the attention of students. And we also want to think about those students who are most introverted and how to make this comfortable for them, how to provide the right opportunities for student learning by really paying attention to what's being said so that there's a coherent math story as the discussion continues. Sometimes we should ask for work samples. Sometimes we should ask for students to do diagramming or drawing. Sometimes that may be best done through technology. We need to think about all of that as we think about what happens in our classroom. And again, making those connections among ideas across the period of discussion so that students are being supported. Sometimes they hear things said, but they don't make connections between two student comments or between what we are discussing mathematically and what's been said. So sometimes we have to explicitly draw out those connections. Other times we may be able to ask a question that will help students realize that connection. So there are many ways that we can put this into place. We just have to think about the strategies we want to use. And there are a host of them. Here are a few. Finally, we have to think about when and where we do this. And what the research suggests is starting at the beginning of the school year is ideal. And maybe not trying to do the whole thing at once, but phase it in. It's helpful to students as we're doing that to have them be reflective about their role as learners. And one of the strategies I found most beneficial as a teacher was to use the operations, so that I would ask students, what wasn't present today that you would like to add in the next time we have an opportunity for math discourse? What happened today that wasn't beneficial that you'd like to subtract? What was so wonderful that you'd like to multiply? You found it very fruitful in terms of your learning. And what was a little bit overwhelming and you'd like to divide? So students as a whole were really good about reflecting on their learning and sharing, and I in turn learned about my teaching. And it allowed me as a teacher to improve my math class and to be really reflective about the learning opportunities and to be okay with students learning from their peers as opposed to learning from me, because the ultimate goal was that they acquire the new knowledge we were supporting. So the how they learned was less important than the fact that they learned, and I gained a lot from this. For most of us, just starting this cold turkey is tough, and so we're better off beginning with a more structured approach and then moving into that less structured approach that requires so much planning time. So it's encouraging if you can weave in some think, pair, shares and turn and talks, or some kind of structured opportunity for conversation. Another possibility is to use what's available in your curriculum. So having carefully reviewed the curriculum that you use and really draw out opportunities for things like think, pair, shares and conversation starters that might be a part of it, and opportunities for discussion, so questions that might be asked that would really support that discourse and communication with students. Again, this structure can be both beneficial for students and beneficial for you as you make the transition to a classroom where your ultimate goal is rich discourse that really promotes the greatest learning opportunities and the greatest gains for students. What questions might you have?
Thanks, Ellen. A lot of great strategies for promoting student discourse in the math classroom. We do have a couple of questions. One of them is, how do you suggest we coach students who need additional support?
Well, one of the ways that you can accomplish that is by working individually with a student who struggles to discuss, modeling and really giving question stems or answer stems to those students, and then transitioning to a paired group and again using question stems and answer stems. That is helpful to students in terms of the thinking. Giving a very narrow and focused task initially as opposed to a broader, more wide open one can also be beneficial. So providing models, providing question and answer stems, modeling yourself, all of those things can help students get started.
Great, thank you. And can you explain again what you mean by sequencing questions?
So, it's very tempting to start out with a broad question like, show us the process you use for solving the problem and justify how it makes mathematical sense. Once it's done, unless a student wants to disagree with the process that a student used or suggest an alternative process or thinks that the student's mathematical reasoning was weak, the discussion's really fairly much over. What you want to start out with is something much more low level. So if your ultimate goal is to have students understand unit fractions and working with unit fractions, you may want to go back and talk about, ask a student to talk about a unit fraction and how do we understand what a unit fraction is, how would you describe a unit fraction. So basically taking a prior knowledge closed-ended question as the first question and then build upon that with what about this problem calls upon us to use our understanding of unit fractions. So you're not talking specifically about the process for solving the problem and you're not talking specifically about why the answer the student came up with makes mathematical sense, but a little bit about what is it we're doing here. And again, more of a prior knowledge question. So you ask 3 or so questions that allow struggling students who may have that prerequisite understanding to have an opportunity to speak and share, and all of us benefit from that sort of remembering. So they're just remembering out loud for us. And again, starting with a more closed-ended couple of questions, moving to the more open-ended.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on today's webinar. And should you have any questions or need any additional information on the programs that Ellen presented or showed in her presentation that promote students talking mathematically, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Ellen, and I will put my email in the chat box for all to have. And we hope to see you on future Sadler webinars. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.